She paid just $4 for a crumbling lighthouse on the foggy cliffs of Willow Creek, broken, leaking, and forgotten by time. Margaret Ellis, a once wealthy widow fleeing betrayal and loss, thought she was buying silence and solitude. But buried within the stone walls was something far greater, a hidden vault, a lost story of love, and a secret that had waited decades to be found. What began as one woman's escape from grief became a journey of faith, redemption, and the rediscovery of light, proving that even in the darkest storms, grace finds a way to shine again. Before we begin, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and may God bless everyone watching. The sea mist rolled low over Willow Creek, wrapping the cliffs in a pale, trembling veil of gray. The lighthouse stood alone at the edge of the world, a tall, crumbling column of stone, its lantern long extinguished, its windows blind with salt and time. Margaret Ellis stepped out of her old Range Rover, pulling her coat tighter against the cold wind. She was 48, with the grace of a woman who had once known luxury but now carried the weight of survival on her shoulders. Her chestnut hair, streaked with early silver, framed a face that had forgotten laughter yet refused to forget dignity. Once she had been a celebrated architect in Boston, her designs adorning magazines, her name whispered in circles of power and art. But grief and betrayal had stripped her of that world. Her husband, David Ellis, a marine engineer with a reckless heart, had perished in a storm 3 years ago while searching for a shipwreck off the coast. And when his body never returned, so too vanished her fortune, swallowed by a partner's fraud and the ocean's cruelty alike. Now, Margaret stood before what she had bought for $300, a lighthouse older than her grandparents, battered and leaning toward the sea like an exhausted pilgrim. She ran her fingers along the stone wall. The surface was cold and rough, flecked with lichen. It would take everything she had to restore it, time, sweat, and whatever pieces of her heart remained. At her feet, Duke, her loyal German shepherd, sat quietly, his ears alert and amber eyes sharp beneath a coat of thick sable and black. He was 8 years old, once trained in a rescue unit before an injury retired him. The scar across his right paw still made him limp slightly, but there was a regal patience in him, as though he understood that life's real strength was silent endurance. Duke had been given to her by a friend of her late husband, and since then he had become her anchor, her only constant in a world that had turned its back. "Looks like it's just you and me, boy," she murmured, her voice hoarse from the chill and something deeper. Duke wagged his tail once, then sniffed the air as if testing this new beginning. Inside, the lighthouse smelled of damp stone and forgotten years. Dust swirled in the pale light that crept through the cracks. The main room was circular, with a winding staircase leading upward into darkness. Rusted lantern hooks hung from the ceiling, and a broken table leaned against the far wall like a wounded soldier. Margaret set down her bags and exhaled. It wasn't Boston. It wasn't marble floors or champagne dinners or gallery openings, but it was hers. That night, as the fog thickened outside and the waves crashed against the cliffs, she built a small fire in the corner hearth. The flames cast trembling shadows across the walls, breathing warmth into the hollow space. Duke lay near her feet, his chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. For the first time in years, Margaret allowed silence to cradle her. Yet peace, she realized, was heavier than sorrow, because it left room for memories. She thought of David, his laughter, his stubborn optimism, the way he had smelled of salt and coffee. She remembered the morning he had left for that final expedition. "Just one more dive, Maggie," he had said, brushing her cheek with his thumb. "After this, we'll have enough to start that coastal project of yours." He'd promised her light and given her darkness instead. Margaret reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small compass, tarnished and worn. David's initials were engraved on the back. She turned it over in her palm until the needle pointed north. "You were supposed to come back," she whispered, her voice cracking. Duke lifted his head, watching her with quiet concern. Hours passed. The fire dwindled to glowing embers. Outside, the sea moaned, an ancient, restless sound. Then Duke's ears pricked. He rose abruptly, muscles tensing, and began to growl, low, deliberate. "What is it?" Margaret straightened, her pulse quickening. Duke padded toward the far wall, the one behind the old spiral staircase. His nails clicked on the stone floor. He sniffed along the base, then barked sharply, once, twice, before scratching at a section of the wall. Margaret frowned. The wall there was darker, its stones slightly misaligned. She crouched beside him, pressing her palm to the cold surface. Something about it felt wrong, too hollow. Maybe mice, she muttered, though her voice lacked conviction. She fetched her flashlight and shone the beam along the wall. That's when she saw it, a faint circular indentation in the mortar, barely visible beneath a thin coat of grime. Her breath caught. "Duke, what did you find?" She pushed experimentally, and the stone shifted. Not much, just enough to hear a dull metallic sound echo from within. A sound too clean, too deliberate to belong to nature. Duke barked again, tail rigid, eyes locked on the spot. Margaret's pulse hammered in her throat. She laughed nervously to herself. "Probably just some old maintenance shaft," she said aloud, as though words could chase away the unease. But her fingers trembled when she traced the outline again. The cold metal beneath the stone hummed faintly, as if alive with a forgotten secret. The wind howled outside, shaking the window panes. The sea thundered louder, as though demanding she stop. But curiosity, that dangerous, intoxicating ember, had already ignited inside her. She pressed her ear against the wall. The sound was clearer now, a faint clang, rhythmic, distant, like metal striking metal from deep below. Her heart skipped. Was it the storm, the pipes, or something buried alive beneath the lighthouse floor? Duke growled once more, low and warning. Margaret whispered, "It's okay, boy," though she wasn't sure if she meant to reassure him or herself. She backed away slowly, sigh, her flashlight trembling in her grip. Outside, lightning split the sky, flooding the room with white for a single heartbeat. In that flash, she thought she saw something, a faint shimmer along the wall, as though something behind it reflected the light. And then it was gone. The storm raged harder. She turned off the flashlight, sat beside Duke, and stared at the wall, heart still racing. "Tomorrow," she whispered to herself. "I'll look again tomorrow." But deep down, she knew she wouldn't sleep, because something inside that wall had moved. The morning after the storm came quiet and gray. The sea had calmed, though the horizon still wore the bruised colors of retreating clouds. Margaret Ellis stood at the base of the lighthouse staircase, one hand resting on the cold stone where Duke had barked the night before. Her other hand held a crowbar. The air still carried the metallic scent of the storm, and the memory of that faint clang echoed in her chest. Duke sat beside her, watchful, his fur still damp from their morning walk. "All right, Duke," she murmured, "let's see what secrets you've dug up." It took her half an hour to loosen the stones. Dust spilled out, followed by the scent of rust and sea salt. Behind the wall was a narrow cavity barely wide enough for her arm. She reached in, fingers brushing against something hard, wood, aged and brittle. Carefully, she pulled out a small wooden chest, no bigger than a bread box, its hinges green with corrosion. A faded brass plate on top read, "S. Brooks, Keeper, 1904. Margaret stared, heart thrumming. "Samuel Brooks," she whispered. She remembered the name from an article she'd skimmed about Willow Creek's history, a lighthouse keeper who had vanished mysteriously in the mid-40s, along with his wife. No one ever found out why the light had gone dark that night, or what became of him. The lock was rusted shut, but years of restoring antiques had taught Margaret patience. She fetched her toolkit from the corner, pried it open gently, and the lid gave way with a sigh. Inside were dozens of letters, yellowed and bound in faded blue ribbon. The first envelope was addressed in careful script, "To my dearest Clara." Margaret sat cross-legged on the cold floor, the sea humming beyond the walls, and began to read. "November 3rd, 1904, my darling Clara. The waves have not been kind this season. The light flickers, and I fear the oil will not last through the month. But what I fear more is your silence. Every night I call to the sea, hoping it carries my voice to wherever you are. I cannot leave the light, not yet. It is all that keeps me from vanishing too." Margaret read in silence. The ink faded, but the emotions still raw. Each letter bled longing and guilt. Samuel wrote of ships that never returned, of nights when the fog was so thick he could not tell where the sea ended and the sky began. But most haunting were the repeated phrases, "Forgive me," and "I see her in the waves." By the fifth letter, her eyes burned. She closed the box and rested her hand on Duke's head. "He kept writing," she whispered, "but he never sent them." Duke gave a low whine, pressing closer as if he understood that this place had held too many ghosts for too long. That afternoon, while scrubbing the lantern room's floor, Margaret heard a knock on the metal door downstairs. The sound startled her. Visitors were rare in Willow Creek, especially to a crumbling lighthouse. Duke barked once, sharp but not hostile. She descended the stairs cautiously and opened the door. Standing outside was a tall man in his early 50s. He had the rugged, sun-worn look of someone who had spent his life near the sea. His hair was streaked with iron gray, his jaw angular beneath a trimmed beard that didn't quite hide the lines of sorrow around his mouth. His blue eyes, though, were striking, steady, clear, and unexpectedly kind. "Morning," he said, removing his cap. "Name's Thomas Reed. Sheriff's office said you bought this place." Margaret nodded warily. "That's right. Is there a problem?" He shook his head. "Not unless you count the power lines. Town says this old light might still be connected to the grid, though half the wiring's probably fried. Thought I'd stop by. I run a boat repair shop down the pier. Used to help with maintenance here, back when it still worked." His voice carried the weight of quiet authority, but there was a gentleness underneath, like a man who had once known command but preferred peace now. Margaret noticed the way he kept rubbing a faint scar on his wrist, a habit of memory rather than pain. She gestured him inside. "I'm trying to get it running again. The light, I mean. I'm an architect by trade, but electricity isn't exactly my strong suit." Thomas smiled faintly. "Then you're braver than most. Mind if I take a look?" He set down his toolbox, barrel, a battered thing covered in paint and rust, and began examining the panels near the staircase. As he worked, Duke sniffed at him curiously before settling by the door, seemingly approving of the newcomer. "So, what made you buy a place like this?" Thomas asked, voice casual but curious. Margaret hesitated. "Peace," she said simply, "or maybe punishment. I haven't decided which." He looked up briefly, studying her face as though recognizing the quiet ache behind her words. "Sometimes they're the same thing," he murmured, turning back to the wires. They worked in silence for a while, broken only by the hum of the sea outside. Then Thomas said, "You know, there's a story about this lighthouse. Folks say the last keeper went mad, claimed he saw someone walking in the waves. His wife, they think. Whole thing ended when he disappeared one winter night, never found the body." Margaret froze. "Samuel Brooks," she said. "I found letters, dozens of them, all written to her, Clara." Thomas's head snapped up, surprise flashing across his features. "You're serious?" She nodded and showed him one of the envelopes. He took it carefully, as though it were a relic. "I remember hearing my grandfather talk about them," he said quietly. "Said Samuel was a good man, just broken after the war. They sent telegrams saying his wife's ship went down near Normandy. He never believed it." Margaret's voice softened. "He waited for her until the end." Thomas looked toward the sea through the cracked window. "A man can lose himself waiting for something that's already gone." Something in his tone made her chest tighten. She wondered what ghosts he carried, what losses had carved those lines in his face. But she didn't ask. Some griefs, she knew, only speak in silence. When Thomas left later that afternoon, the lighthouse felt emptier than before. He promised to return with spare parts to restore the lantern mechanism. As his truck disappeared down the road, Margaret stood in the doorway, wind tugging at her hair. Duke pressed his head against her leg, a silent reminder that she wasn't truly alone. That night, she sat at her desk with the letters spread before her, reading them one by one. The stories began to form a picture of love, guilt, and a man haunted by something he could not undo. The last few pages were smudged, the ink blurred by water or tears. December 19th, 1904 Mai. Clara. The waves called again last night. I saw the light in the fog. Your lantern, I swear it. I heard your voice beneath the wind. If I can reach the rocks before dawn, maybe you'll be there. Maybe I can make this right." Margaret stared at the final words, her heart pounding. "He went after her," she whispered, "into the storm." Duke whined softly, ears flattening. Outside, the wind rose again, echoing through the tower like the sigh of an old soul. She closed the box gently and looked toward the darkened corner where the wall had opened. Something about it unsettled her. The air there still felt colder, heavier, as if the past hadn't finished speaking. And as she turned off the lamp to go upstairs, she could have sworn she heard it again. That faint metallic clang, distant and deliberate, coming from behind the wall where the letters had been buried for 70 years. By evening, the clouds had thickened into bruised mountains above Willow Creek. The sea roared louder than usual, a low, angry growl that seemed to shake the cliffs themselves. The radio had warned of a storm moving inland, but Margaret Ellis had lived through worse, or so she thought. Inside the lighthouse, the wind slipped through the cracks like whispers of the dead. She had been restoring the stairwell since morning, scraping old rust from the railings and brushing cobwebs from the beams. Duke followed her steps faithfully, his nails tapping a steady rhythm on the worn stone. He limped slightly on his injured paw, but his spirit remained unbroken. Margaret had learned to read him the way one reads the sea. His silence, his glances, his sudden tension always meant something. And tonight, Duke was uneasy. By 6 o'clock, thunder cracked across the sky. The first raindrops struck the glass with sharp, cold insistence. Margaret lit the old oil lamps just as the power flickered and died. "So much for the grid," she muttered. The walls groaned as if the storm itself was breathing through them. Duke whined low, pacing in circles. She crouched, pressing her hand to his neck. "It's all right, boy. Just a bit of weather." Yet her voice betrayed the tremor in her chest. A sudden knock at the door startled them both. Through the wavering glass, she saw a shadow, broad-shouldered, hooded in rain. When she opened it, Thomas Reed stood there, soaked to the bone, water dripping from his gray hair and the edges of his beard. His blue eyes looked darker under the storm's light. He held a coil of wire and a toolbox in one hand. "Heard the radio. Figured you'd lose power up here," he said, raising his voice above the wind. "Thought you might need help." "You're insane for driving in this weather," she said, but there was gratitude beneath the scold. He shrugged, half smiling. "You're not wrong. Mind if I come in before I blow away?" They laughed softly, that rare sound that could still exist even when the world howled. Thomas hung his jacket by the door and got to work checking the backup generator. Duke sniffed his boots, tail wagging once before curling up near the fire. "He approves," Margaret said. "He doesn't like most people." Thomas smiled faintly. "That makes two of us." Outside, the storm intensified. Rain lashed the glass panes in violent sheets. The wind screamed through the cracks, and lightning flashed, white and merciless. "This one's worse than they said," Thomas muttered. "You should stay away from the stairs. The structure's old." But Margaret couldn't stay still. Something about the storm set her on edge, as though it was tugging at the memory of another one, 3 years ago, the night she lost David. The same kind of thunder, the same cruel rhythm of the sea. She shuddered, gripping the edge of the table. Thomas noticed. "You all right?" She nodded too quickly. "Fine." But the lie trembled between them. A loud crack echoed above. A beam groaned under pressure. "That's not fine," Thomas said sharply. "We need to brace that ceiling." He grabbed his toolbox and headed toward the upper level. Margaret followed, holding a lantern that swung wildly with each gust. Duke barked once, as if warning them not to go. The spiral staircase shook beneath their feet. Halfway up, lightning illuminated the walls, and that's when Margaret saw it. A thin line in the plaster, faint but unmistakable. Not the same spot where the letters had been found, but near it. The storm's vibration had loosened the wall again. "Thomas, wait," she said, her voice cutting through the thunder. "Here, look." He leaned close, running his calloused fingers along the crack. "That's hollow," he said. "Could be another compartment." Margaret's heart raced. "Help me open it." "Now? In the middle of a storm?" She met his gaze, steady, desperate. "If not now, when?" He sighed. "You're as stubborn as the sea, Ellis." Working together, they pried the loose stones apart. Dust fell like ash. Behind them, Duke barked again, restless, circling near the stair base. The moment the last stone shifted free, a blast of cold air rushed from the cavity, and their lantern flickered. Inside was a metal safe, square, heavy, and wrapped in tarps that had turned black with age. Its lock was a simple dial mechanism, corroded yet intact. Thomas whistled low. "That's old. Looks military issue." Margaret knelt beside it, brushing away grime. "Help me pull it out." Together they dragged it into the open. The safe left scrape marks across the floor, the sound almost swallowed by the storm. Margaret stared at it as if it were alive. "Do you think it belonged to Samuel Brooks?" "Could be," Thomas said, "or whoever came after him." He knelt, examining the dials. "This'll take time. We'd better wait until morning." But Margaret was no longer listening. Her eyes were locked on something etched faintly along the side, letters scratched by hand. "Ellis," her breath caught. "That's my name." Thomas frowned. "You sure?" She touched the mark, the tremor in her fingers undeniable. "It's David's handwriting." Lightning tore across the sky, followed by a thunderclap so loud it rattled the glass. The wind slammed the door open, scattering papers across the floor. Duke barked, running toward the entryway, his furs bristling. "Stay here!" Thomas shouted, grabbing a flashlight and bolting after the dog. Margaret turned back to the safe. Her heart pounded. She reached for the dial, twisting it gently. It wouldn't move at first, then clicked faintly. She tried again, 2 turns left, 1 right. The sound of tumblers echoed softly. Then, another click. The door gave a shudder. Before she could open it, the entire tower groaned. A ceiling beam split with a crack like gunfire. "Thomas!" she screamed. He rushed back just as part of the upper structure gave way. Duke lunged, knocking Margaret sideways as the beam crashed down where she had been standing. The lantern shattered, flames bursting briefly before the rain pouring through the broken glass snuffed them out. Smoke filled the air. "Margaret!" Thomas shouted, hauling the debris away. She coughed, dazed but alive. Duke whimpered beside her, blood streaking his shoulder where the wood had grazed him. "No," she whispered, pulling him close. "No, stay with me." Duke's breath came fast, shallow but steady. His eyes met hers, steady, loyal, unyielding. Thomas knelt beside them, his hands rough but gentle. "We need to stop the bleeding," he said, tearing a strip from his soaked shirt. He bound the wound quickly, his face set in grim focus. Outside, the storm raged like a living beast, but inside, a deeper silence had fallen. The silence of fear and realization. Hours passed before the worst of the storm moved on. The walls still trembled, but the fury had lessened. Margaret sat with Duke's head in her lap, whispering softly, her tears mingling with the rain dripping from the ceiling. Thomas stayed by the doorway, watching, his jaw tight. "You could have died tonight," he said quietly. "So could he," she answered. "But he didn't leave me." Thomas nodded. "Loyal creature, they always are, until we don't deserve them anymore." When dawn finally broke, pale light crept across the ruins of the room. The storm had passed, leaving the world raw and washed clean. Duke slept, his chest rising and falling. Margaret rose stiffly and looked at the safe once more. The door had cracked open in the chaos. Inside were rolled documents, still dry within their sealed case. She lifted them carefully onto the table. The first page bore a heading in fading ink. "SS Marigold Recovery Plan, Confidential." Thomas leaned in. "That's a ship," he said. "A World War II freighter. Rumor said it sank off this coast carrying gold for the Allied effort." Margaret's hand trembled. David was searching for that ship before he died. Thomas looked at her, realization dawning. Then this is what he found. Her throat tightened. And maybe what killed him. For a long moment, neither spoke. The waves outside had grown gentle again, their fury spent. Margaret looked at the sleeping Duke, at the battered walls of her lighthouse, and felt the first sting of something new, hope mixed with dread. She whispered, "The sea took him, but maybe it's trying to give something back." Thomas's gaze held hers, searching, steady. "Be careful what you ask it for," he said. "The sea doesn't return what it keeps without a cost." Outside, the sky cleared to fragile blue. Inside, the safe lay open, its secrets breathing at last. Morning arrived in pieces. Pale sunlight fractured through mist, filtering into the lighthouse like a hesitant apology. The storm had left Willow Creek wounded, yet beautiful, its streets littered with branches and the scent of salt. Inside, Margaret Ellis stood at the table, her fingers trembling over the rolled documents they had retrieved from the safe. Thomas Reed sat opposite her, his face drawn with exhaustion and concern. Duke lay nearby, a fresh bandage wrapped around his injured shoulder, his amber eyes half-lidded but still alert, guarding them as he always had. The pages were fragile, ink faded but legible. They detailed coordinates, sonar scans, and notes written in her husband's unmistakable handwriting. At the top of one sheet were 3 words that froze her blood. "For her protection." Margaret whispered, "He knew." Her voice cracked under the weight of realization. He knew they were coming for him. Thomas leaned forward, elbows on the table, his gaze steady. "You mean David was part of something larger?" She nodded faintly, tracing the ink. "He told me he was working with a salvage team to locate historical wrecks, but this seemed..." She held up the document. "This wasn't archaeology. It was gold, government transport. He must have found the cargo, and when the others realized he wanted out," Thomas finished for her, "they made sure he never came back." The words hung heavy in the air. Outside, the waves lapped gently at the cliffs as if mocking the quiet revelation. Duke stirred, lifting his head, sensing the tension that filled the room. Margaret knelt beside him, her palm brushing through his coarse fur. "You saved me again, didn't you?" she whispered. Just like he would have. Thomas watched her, silent for a moment. There was something unreadable in his eyes, compassion, perhaps, or recognition. Finally, he said, "There's something else here. Look." He unfolded another paper from the pile, a handwritten letter, this one older, its edges browned. The signature at the bottom was faint but familiar. Samuel Brooks. "If this light ever fades, it will not be the storm that kills it, but greed. I hid what men call treasure beneath the very stone that held this tower upright. Let it stay there, not for wealth, but as proof that honesty endures longer than gold. The sea keeps secrets, but the light keeps truth." Margaret's breath caught. He hid it here, not in the ship, under the lighthouse. Thomas's jaw tightened. Then David must have found out. Maybe he wasn't looking for the marigold anymore. Maybe he was trying to protect what Brooks left behind. They exchanged a long, weighted look. The truth had finally begun to take shape, jagged and merciless. David's betrayal wasn't greed, it was sacrifice. Margaret rose and walked to the window, staring out toward the restless horizon. "He died keeping a promise," she said softly, "and I spent 3 years hating him for it." Thomas joined her, standing close enough for her to feel the warmth of his presence. "You can stop now," he said. "You don't owe the past anything anymore." She turned toward him, eyes rimmed with unshed tears. "Don't we all owe the past? It's what brought us here." For a moment, neither spoke. Only the sound of the sea filled the silence between them. An ancient rhythm, forgiving and cruel all at once. Then Thomas gently took the papers from her hands. "If this gold is real," he said, "it could change the town. Blue Hollow's been dying for years. Shops closing, docks rotting. You could sell it, rebuild everything." Margaret looked back at him sharply. "We could rebuild," she corrected, "but not by selling it. We'll use it to restore the lighthouse, to open it again as a museum. We'll make it a place that tells the truth about Samuel Brooks, about David, about what greed destroys." Thomas's expression softened. "That's not the answer most people would choose." She smiled faintly. "Most people haven't lost everything before." They worked in silence through the afternoon, following the markings in Brooks's letter. Beneath the main floor, hidden behind layers of stone, they discovered a narrow trapdoor sealed with a rusted iron ring. Margaret's pulse quickened as she pried it open. The scent of brine and earth rushed up like an exhalation from another century. She shone a lantern down the steps. At the bottom lay a small chamber lined with old stones, its air cool and still. There, wrapped in oilcloth and dust, were several ingots of gold, dull with age, yet unmistakable in their weight. Thomas exhaled slowly. "My God," he whispered, "he really did it." Margaret knelt, running her fingers across the bars. "This is what David died protecting." Her voice trembled, but it wasn't greed or awe, it was reverence. She turned to Thomas. "We can't take it, not for ourselves." He studied her for a long moment. "You're something else, Ellis." She smiled weakly. "Just a woman tired of ghosts." When they climbed back up, dusk had painted the horizon in shades of violet and gold. The storm's wreckage glistened under the fading sun. Margaret sat by Duke, checking his bandage, while Thomas brewed coffee over a small camping stove he'd brought. As the warmth filled the room, she looked at him with quiet gratitude. "You didn't have to stay after the storm." He gave a half smile. "I didn't have anywhere better to be." "Don't you have family?" she asked gently. His eyes darkened a little. "Not anymore. My son, Daniel, was in the Navy. Lost him 7 years ago in the Pacific. After that, I sold the house, opened the boat shop, and stopped answering questions." He gave a dry chuckle. "Guess that makes us both running from ghosts." Margaret's heart softened. She reached across the table, resting her hand lightly on his. "Then maybe it's time we both stopped running." The moment hung fragile between them, 2 lives adrift finally finding the same shore. Later that night, as the moon rose over the ocean, Margaret stood outside the lighthouse with Duke by her side. The lantern light reflected on the water, soft and silver. Thomas joined her, his hands in his jacket pockets. "Looks like the storm cleaned everything it touched," he said. "Except the heart," she replied, smiling faintly. "That takes a little longer." He looked at her then, really looked, the wind tugging at his hair, the sea reflected in his eyes. "You're not as alone as you think, Margaret." She turned toward him. "Neither are you, Thomas." Behind them, Duke barked once, as if approving, tail wagging despite the limp. The sound broke the tension, drawing laughter from both of them, soft, uncertain, but real. Before heading inside, Margaret glanced back at the sea. The waves shimmered under the moonlight, hiding secrets she no longer feared. Somewhere out there, beneath the surface, lay her husband's final promise, and now her own. She whispered into the wind, "The light's safe now, David. I'll keep it burning." Duke pressed against her leg, his head tilted toward the horizon, ears twitching to some unseen rhythm. In that quiet, she could almost swear she heard it, the faintest echo of a man's voice carried through the tide, not sorrowful, but at peace. And as the waves rolled in, the beam from the lighthouse flickered once, then burned steady and bright, cutting through the night as if answering her vow. The sea was calm that morning, a rare kind of stillness that felt like grace. The sun rose behind a veil of silver clouds, spilling soft gold across Willow Creek. The town had changed in the years since the storm, streets repaired, new shops open, laughter drifting from the harbor where silence had once lived. Atop the cliff, the lighthouse stood reborn. Its stones had been scrubbed clean of moss and sorrow, its glass polished until it caught the dawn like a jewel. Above the arched doorway gleamed a brass plaque, the Beacon Museum of Hope. Margaret Ellis stood at the foot of the tower, the breeze teasing loose strands of her chestnut hair. She wore a cream-colored coat and a blue silk scarf, simple yet elegant. Her face had softened. The tiredness that once shadowed her eyes had been replaced with something steadier. Peace. Life no longer pressed down on her shoulders but rested there gently, like a familiar weight she had learned to carry with love instead of pain. Beside her, Thomas Reed adjusted his jacket collar against the morning chill. He looked healthier than he had in years, his once weathered face now marked less by sorrow and more by quiet purpose. The faint lines at the corners of his eyes deepened when he smiled, something he did more freely now. There was still a hint of melancholy in his voice, but it had mellowed into wisdom. His boat repair shop had flourished. He'd trained 2 young apprentices and donated part of his earnings to the town's rebuilding fund. Yet every evening, he still walked the path up the hill to the lighthouse, carrying Duke's favorite biscuits in his coat pocket. And Duke, old Duke, stood proudly between them. His coat had grayed slightly around the muzzle, his gait slower since the injury, but his spirit was as fierce and loyal as ever. A thin scar ran along his shoulder, hidden beneath thick fur, a mark of courage. His eyes, bright as amber glass, seemed to glow in the morning light. Today he wore a small blue bandana that read, "Keeper's Assistant." It had been the idea of Clara Jennings, the town's schoolteacher, a petite woman in her 60s, with silver hair tied neatly in a bun, and spectacles that always slipped down her nose. She adored Duke and had organized the children to make banners for the reopening. "Looks like he knows he's the star of the show," Thomas said, smiling down at the dog. Margaret chuckled. "He's earned it." Clara approached then, bustling with cheerful authority. Her voice carried the crisp warmth of someone used to both leading and comforting. "All right, everyone, places please. The mayor's on his way and we want this to look organized, not like a herd of seagulls." Behind her, a group of children clustered near Duke, holding ribbons and paper lanterns. A boy of about 10, red-haired, freckled, and missing a front tooth, crouched beside the dog, whispering conspiratorially. "You ready, Captain Duke? You lead the parade?" "Okay." Duke barked once, tail wagging, earning delighted laughter from the group. The mayor of Willow Creek, George Halloway, arrived moments later. He was a broad man in his late 50s with a ruddy complexion and a politician's practiced smile, dressed in a navy suit that strained slightly at the buttons. His handshake was firm, his enthusiasm genuine. "Mrs. Ellis, Mr. Reed," he said, "this town owes you more than words can say. What you've done here, it's more than restoration. It's resurrection." Margaret inclined her head modestly. "It was the town's spirit that made it possible. We only helped the light find its way back." The crowd gathered at the base of the hill, villagers, fishermen, and families who had lived through storms of their own. Children waved paper flags. Reporters from the local paper set up cameras. The wind carried the scent of sea salt and blooming jasmine from the gardens below. Thomas stood close enough that his shoulder brushed hers. "You nervous?" he asked quietly. Margaret smiled. "No. For once, I think I'm exactly where I should be." The mayor stepped forward to give his speech, voice booming through the microphone. "A year ago, this lighthouse was a ruin. Today, it stands not just as a monument, but as a promise. a reminder that even after darkness, light can return. The Beacon Museum of Hope will tell the story of courage, of truth, and of the lives that kept our town alive when the world tried to drown it. As the applause rose, Margaret felt her throat tighten. She thought of Samuel Brooks and his lost Clara, of David and the secret he'd died to protect, of Thomas's quiet loyalty and Duke's unshakable faith. All of them, human and not, bound by the same invisible thread of love that endures storms. When the mayor handed her the microphone, she hesitated, then began softly, "There are two kinds of light, one that shows you the path and one that reminds you of home. This lighthouse has been both. To the men and women who built this town, to those who lost and those who rebuilt, this place belongs to you. It's proof that sometimes the heart finds its way back not by escaping the storm, but by walking through it." The crowd fell silent for a heartbeat, then applause thundered again. Thomas reached for her hand, fingers intertwining naturally, effortlessly. "Ready?" he whispered. She nodded. Together they pressed the switch. The great lantern above them flickered, then blazed to life, a golden beam sweeping across the gray sea. The crowd gasped, children cheering as the light spun in slow, majestic circles. Duke barked joyfully, darting forward to lead the children's parade up the stone path, ribbons fluttering behind him. Clara laughed, wiping her eyes with a handkerchief. "Good heavens, that dog's got more charisma than the mayor." Margaret's laughter joined hers, full and genuine. The sound mingled with the waves and the cries of seabirds circling overhead. For the first time, the lighthouse didn't feel haunted. It felt alive. As twilight approached, the celebration lingered. Lanterns glowed along the cliffside, and soft music drifted from a string quartet the mayor had insisted upon. Margaret stood on the balcony with Thomas, looking out at the light slicing across the water. The sea, once an enemy, now shimmered like a living thing. Vast, forgiving, eternal. Thomas slipped an arm around her shoulders. "You did it, Margaret." She leaned into him. "We did it. You, me, and that stubborn dog." Below, Duke was surrounded by children feeding him treats, tail wagging so hard it nearly knocked one of them over. The boy with freckles shouted, "Look, he's smiling!" Margaret laughed softly. "He's always smiling. He just pretends to be tough." Thomas glanced down at the crowd. "Think he knows he saved you that night?" She turned to him, eyes glistening. "He saved me more than once, just not always from falling beams." The light from the tower reached them, washing their faces in gold. Margaret felt its warmth deep in her chest, a steady pulse that matched the rhythm of the sea. She looked up toward the lantern room and whispered, "The light's home again." Thomas kissed her forehead gently. "So are you." As darkness descended, the first full rotation of the beam swept over the crowd, then out toward the horizon, as if to tell the ocean that Willow Creek had found its peace at last. Duke barked one final time, his silhouette framed by the glow. The children laughed, chasing his shadow across the grass. And there, under the resurrected light, Margaret and Thomas stood hand in hand, the wind carrying their quiet joy out to sea. For in that moment, every soul, living or lost, seemed to whisper the same truth. Sometimes, to find yourself again, you must first be broken open by the storm. Sometimes, God doesn't speak through thunder or miracles in the sky. Sometimes, He whispers through a loyal heart, a faithful dog, or a light that refuses to go out. Margaret's story reminds us that even in the darkest nights, there is always a lighthouse, if we dare to look for it. And maybe that lighthouse isn't made of stone at all. Maybe it lives inside each of us, the part that still believes in hope, forgiveness, and second chances. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who needs a reminder that God still works quietly in our lives. Leave us a comment with your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe. So, together we can keep spreading stories of love, faith, and the small miracles that light our way. May God bless you and everyone you hold dear, tonight and always.